The jazz quartet in the corner of the ballroom was playing something slow and melancholic, a stark contrast to the champagne bubbles rising in everyone's glasses, but perfect for the way my wife, Elena, melted into Julian's arms. It wasn't the dance that bothered me. It was the way her eyes remained closed, her head resting on the shoulder of a man who wasn't her husband, right in the center of Boston's most elite social circle. Everyone saw it. The harmless intimacy that I was told to accept as modern friendship. Yet the knot in my stomach whispered a darker truth about boundaries already crossed. If you have ever stood in a crowded room feeling like the only stranger in your own marriage, stay here with me. There are layers to this silence that we need to unravel together, and if you're willing to listen, I'll tell you exactly how the music stopped. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of deals being struck. But for Mark, the evening had narrowed down to a single painful focal point in the center of the dance floor. He stood near the open bar, a sweating glass of scotch in his hand, watching his wife. Elena looked magnificent. She wore a backless emerald gown that clung to her silhouette, the silk shimmering under the chandeliers of the Boston Harbor Hotel. She was the picture of elegance, a curator who knew exactly how to present a masterpiece. But she wasn't dancing with Mark. She was dancing with Julian. Again. It wasn't a fast song. The band was playing a slow, dragging rendition of The Way You Look Tonight, and the distance between Elena and Julian was non-existent. Julian's hand wasn't resting politely on her waist. It was splayed flat against the small of her back, his fingers occasionally tapping a rhythm against her spine. Elena had her forehead resting against his chin, her eyes closed, a small, serene smile playing on her lips, the kind of smile Mark hadn't seen directed at him in months. "They certainly are close," a voice murmured beside him. Mark turned to see Mrs. Sterling, a donor to the museum board, peering over the rim of her champagne flute. Her tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes darted between Mark and the couple on the floor, with pitying curiosity. "Old friends," Mark said, his voice practiced, steady. He took a sip of the scotch, letting the burn distract him. "They grew up together, like siblings, really." "Of course," Mrs. Sterling said, though her gaze lingered on Julian's hand sliding slightly lower as they turned. "Modern friendships are so tactile these days." Mark turned back to the floor, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. Siblings. That was the word Elena always used. "He's my brother, Mark. Don't make it weird." But siblings didn't sway together with their hips locked in perfect synchronization. Siblings didn't whisper into each other's ears with that level of softness. He remembered the fight they'd had in the car, on the way here. He had asked her quietly to maybe spend a little less time with Julian tonight, to actually be with her husband at a couples event. "You're suffocating me," she had sighed, checking her makeup in the visor mirror. "It's harmless freedom, Mark. Why do you always have to sexualize my platonic relationships? It says so much more about your insecurity than it does about me." Harmless freedom. He watched Julian say something that made Elena throw her head back and laugh, a sound that carried over the music. She looked free, certainly. She looked radiant. And Mark felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He checked his watch. 10:15 p.m. They had arrived at 8. He had danced with her once, a stiff 3-minute affair where she scanned the room over his shoulder. Julian had arrived at 9, and she had been in his orbit ever since. The song ended. Mark straightened up, expecting, hoping, that she would make her way back to him. He took a step forward, ready to offer her a drink, to reassert his presence, to be the good husband. But the band struck up the next chord, a jazz standard, and Julian didn't let go of her hand. He didn't even look for Mark. He just leaned in, whispered something, and Elena nodded eagerly. She didn't look for Mark either. Mark stopped. He looked at his hand, the knuckles white around the glass. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was a cold, quiet thing that settled in his chest. He wasn't angry anymore. He was tired. A profound exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He set his unfinished drink on a passing waiter's tray. He didn't storm the dance floor. He didn't cause a scene that would ruin her reputation or his career. He simply turned his back on the beautiful woman in the emerald dress and walked toward the exit doors. Outside, the Boston air was biting and cold, smelling of salt and exhaust. He pulled his phone out and typed a text message. Heading home. Headache. Have fun. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, he deleted headache and have fun. Heading home. He hit send. As he hailed a cab, he looked up at the glowing windows of the ballroom. He wondered if she would even check her phone, or if the music was too loud to hear the notification. "Where to?" the cab driver asked as Mark slid into the leather seat. "Anywhere but here," Mark muttered, then corrected himself. "Beacon Hill, and take the long way." He needed time to think before he returned to the empty apartment that felt less like a home and more like a waiting room. The morning sun hit the marble countertop of their kitchen with an aggressive brightness that made Mark squint. It was 8:00 a.m. on a Sunday, the kind of quiet morning that used to be their favorite. Coffee, newspapers, the shared silence of two people decompiling a busy week. Now, the silence felt like a held breath, pressurized and dangerous. Mark stood by the espresso machine, watching the dark liquid drip into his cup. He hadn't slept well. He had heard Elena come in around 2:15 a.m., her heels clicking softly in the hallway, the hum of her phone vibrating on the nightstand as she finally settled into bed. She hadn't woken him. She hadn't reached for him. Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of silk. Elena walked in, wearing her robe, looking irritatingly fresh for someone who had stayed out so late. She moved with the fluid grace that captivated everyone at the gallery, pulling a mug from the cupboard without looking at him. "You left early last night," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with a casual lightness, as if commenting on the weather. Mark turned, leaning against the counter, his coffee untouched. "I was there until 10, Elena. You didn't notice because you were busy." Elena paused, the spoon in her hand hovering over the sugar bowl. She let out a short, incredulous breath. "Oh, God. Are we doing this? Before I've even had caffeine?" "Doing what?" Mark asked, his voice low. "Asking why my wife spent 3 hours in the arms of another man at a public event while I sat by myself." Elena turned to face him, her expression shifting from tired to disappointed. It was a look Mark knew well, the look of a parent dealing with a petulant child. "He's not another man, Mark. He's Julian," she said, stressing the name as if it explained everything. "He's going through a rough patch with his investors. He needed a friend. I was being a friend. Why do you have to make everything so sordid?" "It's not about being a friend," Mark countered, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "It's about boundaries. You were slow dancing with him for an hour. People were staring, Elena." Mrs. Sterling made a comment. Elena scoffed, pouring oat milk into her cup. Mrs. Sterling is a relic. She thinks women should still be seen and not heard. And honestly, Mark, I thought you were more evolved than that. This, she gestured vaguely at him, this possessiveness, it's not attractive. It's actually really stifling. Mark felt the familiar twist in his gut, the sensation of the ground shifting. She was doing it again, taking his valid hurt and repackaging it as a character flaw. I'm not trying to possess you, he said, pleading for her to understand. I just wanted to be with you. It was our night out, too. And we could have been, she said smoothly, taking a sip of her coffee. If you hadn't sulked in the corner and then run away like a teenager, you could have come over. You could have danced with us. But no, you chose to isolate yourself so you could play the victim this morning. She walked past him toward the living room, trailing the scent of expensive shampoo. I refuse to apologize for having a life that doesn't revolve around your insecurities, Mark. It's harmless freedom. If you can't handle me having a male best friend without falling apart, maybe you should talk to someone about that. Mark stood alone in the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator seemed deafening. The argument had lasted less than 2 minutes, and somehow, he was the one left feeling guilty, wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe he was too sensitive. Maybe he was the problem. He looked down at his phone. A notification popped up from Instagram. It was a story Julian had posted at 1:45 a.m. It was a blurry selfie of him and Elena in the back of a dim Uber, both laughing, her head resting on his shoulder. The caption read, "Partners in crime." Mark swiped the notification away. He picked up his coffee, but the smell of it suddenly made him nauseous. He poured it down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl and disappear. "I'm going into the office," Mark called out, his voice flat. "On a Sunday?" Elena's voice floated back from the living room, unbothered, already distracted. "Okay, don't work too hard." She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask if he was okay. As Mark grabbed his keys and walked out the door, he realized that the gaslighting worked not because he believed her, but because the alternative, accepting that she simply didn't care enough to stop hurting him, was too painful to face. Not yet. The reservation was at Menton, a place Mark had booked 3 months in advance. It was the kind of restaurant where the lighting was kept low to flatter the clientele, and the silence was heavy with the expectation of excellence. It was their 5th anniversary, a milestone that Mark had foolishly convinced himself would serve as a reset button. He had arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in the charcoal suit Elena used to say she loved, a small velvet box tucked securely in his jacket pocket. Now, it was 45 minutes past the reservation time. The candle in the center of the table had burned down a noticeable inch. Mark took a sip of water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. Across from him, the empty chair seemed to mock him, a void in the perfectly curated room. The sommelier had approached twice to ask if he wanted to order wine, and twice Mark had politely declined, saying he was waiting for his wife. The third time the staff looked his way, it wasn't with service in mind, but pity. His phone buzzed on the white tablecloth. It wasn't a text. It was a call. Elena. He picked it up, keeping his voice low to match the hush of the room. "You're almost an hour late, Elle. I'm about to lose the table." "Mark, I can't make it." Elena's voice came through, breathless and rushed. There was background noise, traffic, a car door slamming. Mark felt a cold numbness spread through his chest. "It's our anniversary, Elena. I know, and I feel terrible, really," she said, though she sounded more frantic than apologetic. "But Julian just called me. It's a disaster. His girlfriend, that model, Savannah, she moved out while he was at work. She took the dog, Mark. He's in pieces. I'm heading over to his loft right now because he shouldn't be alone." Mark closed his tongue, eyes inhaling the scent of truffle oil and expensive cologne that permeated the air. "He's 32 years old, Elena. He can handle a breakup. I'm sitting at Menton waiting for my wife. He's not just handling a breakup. He's devastated." Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. "I can't believe you're being this selfish right now. We can do dinner any night. We can go next week. This is an emergency." "It's always an emergency with him," Mark said quietly. Last month it was his panic attack about the merger. The month before that, he needed help picking out furniture. There is always a reason why he needs you more than I do. "Stop keeping score," she snapped. "I'm going to be there for him because that's what loyalty looks like. I'll make it up to you, okay? Just go home and order takeout. We'll talk tomorrow." The line went dead. Mark lowered the phone slowly. He stared at the dark screen, waiting for the anger to come, waiting for the urge to throw the glass or storm out. But the anger didn't come. Instead, a strange, hollow clarity settled over him. It was the feeling of a heavy weight finally being dropped, not because the burden was gone, but because he had simply decided to stop carrying it. The waiter approached again, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, the kitchen will be closing the tasting menu shortly. Shall I hold the table a bit longer?" Mark looked up. He looked at the empty chair where his wife should have been, visualizing her at Julian's loft, pouring him whiskey, listening to his woes, giving him the intimacy that legally and morally belonged at this table. "No," Mark said, his voice steady. "My wife isn't coming." The waiter grimaced apologetically. "I'm very sorry, sir. Would you like the check for the water?" "Actually," Mark said, picking up the menu he hadn't opened yet, "I'll take the chef's tasting menu, with the wine pairing, for one." The waiter blinked, surprised, but quickly recovered his professional mask. "Excellent choice, sir." Mark sat alone in the sea of couples. When the first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of scallop and caviar, he didn't rush. He ate slowly, savoring the complexity of the flavors. He drank the wine. He watched the other couples holding hands, whispering secrets. And he realized he wasn't jealous of them anymore. He was mourning them, like looking at old photographs of a dead relative. He didn't text Elena. He didn't ask how Julian was. He sat in the center of his own life, finally occupying the space he had been shrinking to accommodate her. The velvet box in his pocket felt heavy, a paperweight anchoring him to a past version of himself. He wouldn't give it to her. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. As he finished the final course, a dark chocolate ganache, Mark realized something terrifying and liberating. He was having a better time alone than he would have had if she were here complaining about his mood. He paid the bill, left a generous tip, and walked out into the cool Boston night. He didn't hail a cab to go home. He didn't want to go back to the empty apartment. Instead, he started walking toward the waterfront, his phone silent in his pocket, breathing in the cold air of a freedom he hadn't asked for, but was beginning to understand. 2 weeks after the anniversary dinner, the architecture firm was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the HVAC system and the clicking of Mark's mouse. It was 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a grid of amber and white lights. a sprawling map of people going home to their families. Mark wasn't going home. Elena had texted at 6. Julian needs help with the loft staging for his open house. Don't wait up. He hadn't replied. You're still here. A soft voice broke the silence. Mark looked up from his blueprints. Nora stood in the doorway of his office, holding 2 paper cups. She was wearing a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose clip. A stark contrast to the high-maintenance glamour that defined Elena's circle. Nora was the firm's landscape architect, a woman who understood the quiet language of soil and stone better than she understood corporate politics. Just finishing the renderings for the Seaport project, Mark said, rubbing his temples. You finished those yesterday, Nora pointed out gently. She walked in and placed one of the cups on his desk. Decaf. I figured you didn't need the jitters this late. Mark looked at the cup, then up at her. Her eyes were warm, devoid of the frantic energy that usually greeted him at home. There was no drama here, no crisis, no emotional vampire needing to be fed, just a cup of decaf coffee. Thank you, Nora, he said, and he meant it more than he should have. She lingered for a moment, looking at the design on his screen. You know, the courtyard needs more privacy. If you angle the retaining wall by 10 degrees, you'd create a hidden pocket. A place for people to just be. Mark turned back to the screen, visualizing her suggestion. She was right. It was a brilliant, subtle adjustment. You have a good eye for sanctuary, Nora. I think everyone needs a place to hide sometimes, she said. The comment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. She knew about Elena. Everyone in their social circle knew about Elena and Julian, even if they pretended not to. I'm starving, Mark said suddenly, surprising himself. Have you eaten? Nora shook her head. I was just going to grab a salad downstairs. Let me buy you dinner, Mark said. He stood up, grabbing his coat. Real dinner, not a salad in a plastic container. For a split second, he felt the old reflex, the guilt. Married men don't take female colleagues out for late dinners. It was the rule he had lived by for 7 years. But then he heard Elena's voice in his head, clear as a bell. It's harmless freedom, Mark. Why do you have to sexualize everything? If Elena could spend nights on Julian's couch, surely Mark could have pasta with a colleague who actually respected his work. They went to a small Italian bistro around the corner. It wasn't romantic in the candlelight and roses sense, but it was intimate. They sat in a booth, and for the first time in months, Mark laughed. He didn't have to filter his words or worry about triggering a defense of Julian. They talked about urban planning, about the terrible coffee in the break room, about Nora's obsession with vintage maps. When the bill came, Mark reached for it. You don't have to, Nora said, her hand brushing his wrist for a fraction of a second before pulling back. It's a work dinner. I want to, Mark said. He looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't Elena. She wasn't exciting in that dangerous, consuming way. She was safe. She was interested in him, not what he could provide or fix. As they walked out onto the street, the wind whipped around them. Mark checked his phone. No missed calls, no texts. Elena was likely still at the loft, perhaps drinking wine with Julian, perhaps dancing in his living room. I should get a cab, Nora said, wrapping her coat tighter. I'll wait with you, Mark said. They stood side by side on the curb, close enough that their arms brushed. Mark didn't step away. He felt a strange sense of vertigo, not from fear, but from the realization of how easy it was. This was what Elena felt, he realized. This lack of weight. The intoxicating simplicity of receiving attention without the burden of commitment. When Nora's cab pulled up, she turned to him. "Thanks for tonight, Mark. I really needed the distraction." "Me too," he said. He watched her car disappear into the traffic. He felt no guilt. In fact, he felt a cold, jagged sense of justification. He took his phone out and finally replied to Elena's text from hours ago. "Working late with a colleague. Grabbed dinner. See you later." It was the truth. It was completely innocent. And it was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. The blue light of the television flickered across the living room walls, casting long, dancing shadows over the pristine white furniture. Elena sat on the sofa, her legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone. It was a rare evening where she was home before Mark. Usually she was the one breezing in late, smelling of wine and gallery openings. But tonight, the apartment was silent, save for the low murmur of the news. Mark was at a site inspection. That was what he had said. Elena's thumb hovered over the screen. She refreshed her feed. The algorithm, usually filled with art installations and Fashion Week updates, served her something different. It was a post from the architecture firm's official account, tagged 20 minutes ago. Late nights and bright lights at the Seaport project. The vision coming together. The photo was candid, shot in black and white, giving it an artistic, intimate grit. In the foreground, there were blueprints sprawled over a makeshift table made of crates, but the focus was on the two figures behind it. Mark was there, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a hard hat tucked under one arm. He was laughing, head thrown back, eyes crinkled at the corners, a genuine, unguarded expression that Elena realized with a start she hadn't seen in months. And next to him, leaning in close to point at something on the paper, was a woman. Nora. Elena knew the name now. Mark had mentioned her twice in passing. In the photo, Nora was looking at Mark, not the blueprints. There was a softness in her posture, a comfortable proximity that wasn't sexual exactly, but it was familiar. It was the kind of body language that said, "We share a language you don't speak." Elena felt a prickle of heat climb up her neck. She zoomed in on Mark's face. He looked alive. He looked lighter. The sound of the front door unlocking made her jump. She quickly locked her phone and tossed it onto the cushion beside her, smoothing her expression into one of casual disinterest. Mark walked in, bringing the cold autumn air with him. He looked tired, but there was a residual energy about him, a hum of satisfaction that grated on her nerves. "You're home," she said, muting the TV. "Hey," Mark said, hanging his coat up. Traffic was a nightmare coming out of the seaport. "I saw the post," Elena said before she could stop herself. Mark paused, loosening his tie. He turned to look at her, his face impassive. "What post?" "The firm's Instagram," she said, trying to keep her voice light, airy. "You and Nora? You two looked like you were having a lot of fun for a construction site." Mark walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. "It's a good project, Elle. We finally cracked the courtyard design. It was a relief." Elena followed him to the kitchen doorway. She crossed her arms. "She's very pretty, in a quiet sort of way." Mark took a long drink of water, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the glass. "I suppose so. She's a brilliant landscape architect." "You seem to be spending a lot of time with her lately," Elena said. The words tasted sour, hypocritical, but she couldn't stop them. The image of Nora looking at Mark was burned into her retina. Dinners, late nights, now this. Mark set the glass down. He didn't get angry. He didn't defend himself. He simply leaned against the counter and gave her a small, confused smile. "We're colleagues, Elena," he said, his voice calm. "We're working on a major deadline. You know how it is. It's just work." "It didn't look like just work," she muttered. The way she was standing, it looked personal. Mark let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "You're overthinking it. It's harmless, Elle. Nora is just a friend from work. Why does everything have to be something sinister with you?" Elena stiffened. The words were a direct echo. They were her words. He was using her shield, her favorite, defense, and he was wielding it with terrifying precision. "I didn't say it was sinister," she backpedaled, flushing. I worry about how it looks. You know people talk." "Let them talk," Mark said, walking past her toward the bedroom. He paused right next to her, close enough that she could smell the cold air and coffee on him, but he didn't touch her. "It's just freedom, Elena. Harmless freedom. Isn't that what we believe in?" He left her standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the expensive appliances of their perfect life. Elena reached for her phone again, pulling up the photo. She looked at the number of likes climbing. She looked at the comments. "Great team. You two have such great chemistry on this project." She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. For the first time, she wasn't the one setting the tempo of their marriage. She was the one watching from the sidelines, wondering just how much freedom Mark was willing to claim before he stopped coming back at all. The Boston Public Library had been transformed into a cavern of gold light and winter greenery. Bates and Associates spared no expense for their annual holiday gala, renting the breathless expanse of the McKim building. Waiters in white jackets moved like silent pawns through the crowd of architects, developers, and city officials, carrying silver trays of champagne. Mark stood near one of the marble lions at the base of the grand staircase, adjusting his cufflinks. He checked his phone once. "Julian having a crisis with the catering for his launch. I'll be there in 30. Start without me." The text was an hour old. 3 months ago, Mark would have spent this hour pacing the vestibule, thumb hovering over the dial button, worrying about whether she would make it in time for the partner's toast. He would have made excuses to his boss. He would have felt the familiar crush of anxiety that he was essentially alone in a room full of couples. Tonight, he simply slid the phone back into his tuxedo pocket and turned his back on the entrance. "You look like you're analyzing the load-bearing capacity of the staircase," a voice said. Mark turned. Nora stood there, holding 2 flutes of sparkling wine. She wasn't wearing emerald silk or anything backless. She wore a deep navy velvet dress, modest in cut, but striking against her pale skin. She looked grounded. Real. "Occupational hazard," Mark smiled, accepting the glass. "I was actually thinking about how much better this room looks when you aren't trying to find someone in it." Nora's eyes searched his face for a moment, understanding the subtext. She didn't press. "Well, the partners are starting the speeches in the courtyard. Shall we?" "We shall." They walked together into the courtyard, moving through the crowd with an ease that drew glances. Mark introduced Nora to a city councilor he knew. She charmed the man effortlessly, not with flirtation, but with a sharp critique of the city's new zoning laws. Mark watched her, feeling a swell of pride that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with respect. By the time the speeches ended and the live band began their second set, the atmosphere had shifted from formal to festive. Mark hadn't looked at the door in 45 minutes. "Do you dance, Mark?" Nora asked. The band was playing a cover of La Vie en Rose, slow and melodic. Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second. He thought of the charity gala. He thought of Elena's head resting on Julian's shoulder, her eyes closed, the way she had called it freedom. "I do," Mark said. He offered his hand. Nora took it, her fingers cool and slender. They moved to the center of the floor. Mark placed his hand on her waist, firmly, respectfully, but with a deliberate closeness. They moved well together. It wasn't the frantic, showy chemistry Elena had with Julian. It was a smooth, synchronized glide. Mark looked down at Nora, and she looked up at him, smiling at something he had whispered about the senior partner's toupee. For a moment, the room fell away. Mark felt seen. He felt appreciated. He felt free. Then, he felt the shift in the room's energy. He looked up. Standing at the edge of the courtyard, framed by the stone arches, was Elena. She had arrived. She was breathless, her coat slipping off one shoulder, looking frantic and beautiful in crimson. She was scanning the crowd, her eyes wide, searching for the husband she had left waiting. Her gaze landed on them. Mark saw the exact moment the realization hit her. He saw her breath hitch. She froze, watching Mark spin Nora gently, watching them laugh. She was watching her husband hold another woman with the same tender, public intimacy she had claimed was harmless for years. Mark didn't stop. He didn't pull away guiltily. He didn't rush to her side to apologize for enjoying himself. He held Nora's gaze for a second longer, finishing the turn, and only then did he look toward Elena. He offered her a small, polite nod, acknowledging her presence, but refusing to let it interrupt his song. The music played on, and for the first time in their marriage, Elena was the one standing on the outside, watching a dance she wasn't invited to. The song ended, and the applause was polite, scattered, and distant. Mark let go of Nora's waist, stepping back with a gentlemanly nod that felt entirely natural. Nora smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her eyes, and excused herself to get a glass of water. Mark didn't have time to follow her. Before he could take a step, a hand clamped around his bicep. The grip was tight, the fingernails digging in through the fabric of his tuxedo. "We are leaving," Elena hissed. Her voice was low, trembling with a rage she was barely containing. "I haven't said goodbye to the senior partners," Mark said, his voice level. He didn't pull his arm away, but he looked down at her hand with a detached curiosity. "And you just got here." "Don't you dare!" Elena snapped, her eyes wide and glassy. She yanked him toward the side exit, past the marble lions, and into the dim, vaulted corridor that led to the coat check. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, muffling the music and the chatter, sealing them in a sudden, ringing silence. Elena spun around, her chest heaving. The crimson dress that had looked so striking a moment ago now seemed to clash with the pale fury on her face. "What the hell was that, Mark?" she demanded, her voice rising, bouncing off the stone walls. "In front of everyone? In front of the counselor? You were practically making love to her on the dance floor." Mark leaned against the stone wall, sliding his hands into his pockets. He felt remarkably calm. It was the calm of a man who had already watched the house burn down and was now just kicking through the ashes. "We were dancing, Elena," he said. "It was a foxtrot, standard ballroom, nothing scandalous." "Don't give me that," she spat, pacing a tight circle in front of him. I saw the way you looked at her. I saw her hand on your shoulder. The way you were whispering. Everyone was staring, Mark. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to walk into a room and see my husband flaunting some office fling? Fling? Mark raised an eyebrow. Nora is a colleague, a friend. We have a lot in common. She understands my work. She's a landscape architect, Mark, not your soulmate, Elena shouted, her composure cracking completely. You are married. You don't get to cultivate these little emotional affairs and call it friendship. It's disrespectful, it's cheap, and I won't stand for it. Mark watched her. He listened to the words tumbling out of her mouth. Disrespectful, emotional affair, humiliated. They were heavy words, sharp words, and they were all the words he had swallowed for 3 years. He pushed off the wall and took a step toward her. Elena faltered, stepping back, perhaps expecting him to yell. But he didn't raise his voice. He lowered it. You're right, Mark said softly. Elena blinked, confused by the sudden agreement. Exactly. I'm glad you finally admit it. It feels terrible, doesn't it? Mark continued, his eyes locking onto hers. To walk into a room and see the person you love giving their best energy to someone else. To see a touch that lingers a second too long. To wonder what they talk about when you aren't there. Mark, this isn't the same. It is exactly the same. He cut her off, his voice hardening like concrete. For 3 years, Elena, I have watched you sit on Julian's lap. I have watched you leave our bed to answer his calls. I have watched you slow dance with him at my own birthday party while I sat alone. And every single time I tried to tell you how it hurt, what did you say? Elena opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked stricken. Mark stepped closer, encroaching on her space, forcing her to look at him. You told me it was harmless, freedom. You told me I was insecure. You told me I was trying to own you. That's different, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. Julian is family. And Nora understands me, Mark said, throwing her logic back with brutal precision. Why do you have to sexualize my platonic relationships, Elena? Why are you being so controlling? It says so much more about your insecurity than it does about me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena stared at him, the color draining from her face as the reflection of her own cruelty stared back at her. She realized, in that cold corridor, that he wasn't cheating on her. He was showing her what she had done to him. Mark, she said, her voice cracking. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his lapel. Please, let's just go home. Please. Mark looked at her hand. He didn't brush it away, but he didn't lean into it either. He felt a profound sense of loss, not for the woman standing in front of him, but for the version of her he had tried so hard to believe in. You can go home, Mark said, stepping back out of her reach. I promised Nora I'd get her a cab. It's the gentlemanly thing to do. He turned his back on her. Mark! She cried out, the sound desperate, echoing off the high ceilings. He didn't stop. He pushed the heavy doors open, letting the music and the light flood back in, leaving his wife alone in the shadows of the corridor, trapped in the reality she had built for herself. The sound of a zipper closing usually signified a beginning, a vacation, a business trip, a weekend getaway. But in the gray light of Sunday morning, the sound of Mark closing his leather suitcase sounded like a gavel striking wood. It was final. He stood by the bed, looking at the room one last time. He had packed efficiently. 7 years of marriage, and it fit into 2 bags and a garment box. He hadn't taken the photos. He hadn't taken the coffee maker they bought in Italy. He left the life. He was only taking the man. The door flew open. Elena stood there, her hair disheveled, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She looked as if she hadn't slept, her eyes rimmed with red, her face pale and drawn. "I did it," she said, her voice breathless, desperate. She held the phone out toward him, the screen glowing. Look, Mark. I blocked him. Everywhere. I sent him an email telling him I can't see him anymore. I told him my marriage is more important." Mark didn't look at the phone. He continued to button his coat. "I called the gallery," she rushed on, stepping into the room, navigating around the boxes as if they were landmines. "I told them I'm stepping down from the committee he chairs. I'm done, Mark. He's gone. It's just us. I fixed it." Mark picked up his car keys from the nightstand. He finally turned to look at her. There was no anger in his eyes, which terrified Elena more than the shouting match at the library. There was only a calm, impenetrable distance. "You didn't fix it, Elle," he said softly. "What do you mean?" Her voice rose to a panic. "I cut him out. That's what you wanted, isn't it? You wanted him gone. He's gone. I chose you." "You chose me today," Mark corrected her, "because you were embarrassed, because you felt a fraction of what I've felt for 3 years, and you couldn't handle it." "I made a mistake," she cried, tears spilling over. "I was blind. I see that now. I see how it looked. But I'm changing it. Doesn't that count for something?" Mark sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "The problem wasn't Julian, Elena. Julian was just the symptom. The problem was that you looked at me, saw I was in pain, and told me my pain didn't matter because it inconvenienced your fun. You called my boundaries controlling until you needed them for yourself." He picked up the suitcase. The wheels hummed softly against the hardwood floor. "Mark, please," she begged, grabbing his arm. "We can go to therapy. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't leave. You can't just throw 7 years away because of a bad night." Mark gently removed her hand from his arm. He held it for a second, a final, ghostly connection, before letting it drop. "I'm not throwing it away," he said. "You spent 3 years dismantling it, brick by brick. I'm just finally walking out of the ruins." He walked past her, out into the hallway. The apartment was silent. The art on the walls, the expensive rugs, the perfectly curated life. It all felt like a stage set for a play that had been canceled. "Where will you go?" Elena whispered from the bedroom doorway, her voice small, broken. "I don't know," Mark admitted. He paused at the front door, his hand on the brass knob. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I don't have to fight to be seen." "I love you," she said, a last-ditch prayer thrown into the void. Mark looked back at her. He believed her in a way. She loved him as much as she was capable of loving anything that she felt she owned. "I know," Mark said, "but you love your freedom more. And now, you have it." He opened the door and stepped out. The lock clicked shut behind him, a sharp mechanical sound that echoed in the stairwell. Outside, the Boston morning was crisp and bright. The wind bit at his cheeks, stinging and real. Mark walked to the curb, hailed a cab, and loaded his bags into the trunk. As the car pulled away, merging into the traffic of the city, he didn't look back at the window of the apartment. He rolled the window down, letting the cold air rush in, filling his lungs. It wasn't happiness he felt yet. It was too soon for that. But as he watched the skyline recede, he recognized the feeling. It was the first breath of air after being underwater for a very long time. It was his own freedom, and this time it wasn't harmless, it was necessary.